Peace, and peace. Hope everybody's doing well. Welcome to Striking Resemblance, episode 7. She concluded from her conversations with Jasmine the previous evening. Jasmine was feeling things which she had not ever sincerely felt for a man before. Though she knew Jasmine was attracted to some men, the feelings were not as extreme as they were for Peter, and Tierney was wondering how Jasmine was coping. Tierney knew what it was like to feel so strongly for a man because she herself was fanatically in love with a man at once. It was before she met Cookie, her very first serious relationship with a woman. The man, which was how Tierney spoke of him, broke her heart with his cheating. He knew how much Tierney loved him, which is why he treated her the way he did, but she was never a dummy, and it did not take long for her to figure out leaving him would certainly be best for her. She would pick up the pieces of her broken heart and take them elsewhere to put them back together. Anyway, Tierney decided to call Jasmine to see how she was holding up. "Miss Ambrose, you have a call on line 1," the secretary's voice came over the intercom. "Who is it?" Jasmine politely asked. "It's Miss Elliott," the secretary replied. "Thank you. Put her through, please," Jasmine said. "Hi, sweetheart," she continued lightly into the phone after being connected. "Hi, how are you holding up?" "Holding up? Well, I'm doing fine, I guess, but why would you ask that?" Jasmine replied. "I was just thinking about Peter and," Tierney began. "Oh, I know what you mean now. Well, I was a little heat struck earlier when he was here," Jasmine said in a sort of boastful way. "He was there?" Tierney exclaimed. "Yes, he came to discuss business, though," Jasmine said. "So what now?" "Well, things went fairly well, and he liked a lot of my suggestions. He'll be coming back to L.A. in a week or two, so we can begin putting things in motion," Jasmine explained. "Back to L.A.?" Tierney asked. "Yes, he has some business to take care of in Atlanta, so he had to fly out today. But he will be back," Jasmine answered. "That's good to know. I wish I could have gotten an opportunity to see him before he left, but oh well. And since I know you're right, I'm going to get back to work. Since I know you're all right, I'm going to get back to work, okay? I love you, and I'll see you for lunch," Tierney said. "Okay, I love you too, sweetheart, and I can't wait." Chapter 4. In a small, dank, one-room apartment, a woman in her mid-50s sits staring out of her dingy window with her thick salt and pepper hair pulled back in a bun and covered with a hairnet. In her slightly coffee-stained uniform, tightly fitting, legs crossed, and hands laid on her lap, she sits in an old raggedy sofa lounge chair with her weary, bloodshot brown eyes observing every single person who walked by on the street below. Pimps, pushers, prostitutes, peddlers, and police. Anything and everybody who moved or walked by, she watched. It had been approximately 30 years since her last glimpse, and even though she would not know when she saw whatever or whoever it was which she had been searching for so long, hope was the only thing that kept her alive, if that's what you want to call it. It had been a little over 3 months since Margaret last mustered up the strength to clean her apartment. Her strength came only in very moderate and periodic spurts. The air in the apartment was dusty and dry, almost enough to suffocate a person, with a smell which was a mixture of mildew, body odor, and mothballs. Sometimes she would sit for days, caught up in her own thoughts, gazing out that window, only to be brought back by a knock at her door. Most times it would be either the big, burly, scraggly, bearded landlord coming to collect the $250 a week rent, $250 a month rent, or one of her employees coming to check on her and to remind her of the fact that she had to work. It was fully understood by many just what the woman was going through. Everyone who was aware of her burdensome past sympathized with her. Her employer was extremely patient with her, too. She would have occasional fainting spells where she would just fall out while working and have to sit for 20 or 30 minutes before she could get back on her feet. And though she was only 52 years old, her appearance caused most to regard her as a very elderly woman. Ever since her husband of only 2 years died 32 years prior of pneumonia, her life had been horribly miserable. At only 20 years old at the time, Margaret was faced with a life which would crucify her soul. She herself was stricken with a serious illness shortly after her husband's death and was lucky to have lived through it. Sometimes she wished he had died because, as a result of the illness, she was forced to give up her most precious possessions. And due to circumstances beyond her control, along with the lack of money and a hospital bill which would take her nearly 10 years to pay off, retrieving her possessions became virtually impossible. Occasionally, she would get recurring disappointing letters which basically said, no luck, that she would put in a drawer with the many other no luck letters. Afterwards, she would then drift back into her immobilizing state of misery. Tears had not fallen from her eyes in over a decade, though she used to cry all of the time. Now the painful fire which burned inside was no longer quenching. Her well was dry. There were no more tears, nothing left but an ever-burning fire inside which imprisoned her soul in a living hell. Her name was Margaret Simmons Buckley. She was born and raised in a small Alabama town called Prattville, the 10th of 13 children who grew up very poor in a small 2-room wooden house. Slavery no longer existed in the South during that time, but blacks were still treated cruelly and denied many job opportunities. Cotton picking, hay baling, and other farm labor jobs were basically the only jobs blacks had no problem getting. And by the time she was 6 years old, Margaret, both her parents, and 9 of her brothers and sisters were working together in cotton fields. Though her parents were surprisingly loving considering their situation and instilled not only a sense of family unity, but religious values in all of their children. Margaret despised her life. In all her children. Margaret despised her life, resented her family, and hated picking cotton or any other labor which was abundantly piled on her and her family. She longed to get out of that house, away from her suffering family, and out of Alabama. By the time Margaret was barely 17, most of her older brothers and sisters had run away from home, and her parents had began slowly deteriorating from the many decades of hard labor they had done in their lives. This meant they could not do as much work, basically boiling down to the fact that the children would have to pick up the slack. Yet with only 5 children left at home, the work was hard. So much pressure ultimately prompted Margaret to run away with a boy, Simon Buckley, who she had been secretly seeing since she was barely in her teens. He lived not far from where she did, and late at night, they would meet in a wooded area near both their homes. During one of their midnight rendezvous, they decided to run away to North Carolina to get married. They settled in Asheville, North Carolina, where Simon died only 2 years later. It had been 2 days since Margaret had been out of her apartment. She had neither bathed nor taken off her work clothes. There was a half-eaten ham sandwich, which had begun to mold, and a full glass of water and a dirty glass sitting on an end table, which sat next to Margaret. She grew up in a good family. She did not run away. Though she did run away, her family was very close-knit, instilling a certain extent of family value and stressed the desire to fulfill family obligations. Margaret's running away had nothing to do with the loss of love of her family. Her desire to run stemmed from the dissatisfaction she felt over a good family working so hard to reap no better prosperity than poverty. And though her personal obligations changed, it had come time for her to start thinking of herself and her future family. She did not want the same for her unborn son, but how could she have done such a thing? It was not the way she was brought up, and she agonized over it. She was tormented all of her life as punishment for what she considered an unforgivable deed. What else could she have done, though? Her life had taken a drastic change for the worse. She basically had no other choice. Workers at Freddy's Diner, which was where Margaret worked, recognized the misery overwhelming Margaret and offered a considerable amount of support. Pity, along with the fact that even with her lack of communication, Margaret was a kind and gentle woman, caused some of the workers to look out for her. And with that, I'm going to end it. Follow me for episode 8. Peace.